Hello, this is Shafiur Rahman. In this episode, you'll hear an AI narrated version of my recent critique of Twan Mrat Naing's interview. It's a detailed analysis of how the Arakan Army shapes its public narrative.
You're listening to Rohingya Refugee News, featuring the work of journalist and filmmaker Shafiur Rahman. In this episode, you'll hear Shafiur's widely discussed critique of General Twan Mrat Naing's recent interview, a sharp examination of how the Arakan Army manages its narrative, projects control, and reframes reconciliation on its own terms. For the full article and related analyses, visit Rohingya Refugee News. What the Arakan Army offers the Rohingya. Throughout 2025, the Arakan Army has faced a torrent of international scrutiny over its conduct in Arakan or Rakhine state, scrutiny that is no longer limited to Myanmar's military. A series of reports from Human Rights Watch, Fortify Rights, UN human rights bodies and Rohingya organisations like Kaladan Press have laid bare a disturbing pattern of abuse against Rohingya civilians and other ethnic communities living in territory under Arakan Army control. Allegations include forced labour, abductions, arbitrary detention, systematic pillage, and extrajudicial killings, including beheadings, in areas the Arakan Army now governs. These accusations have been bolstered by satellite imagery, survivor testimony, photographic and video evidence, and even admissions from the Arakan Army itself, such as the execution of 2 prisoners of war in January 2025. It is in this context that Arakan Army General Twan Mrat Naing's recent interview in the Irrawaddy must be read, not as a gesture of transparency or reckoning, but as a carefully orchestrated counter-narrative. Rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing, Twan Mrat Naing strikes a posture of grievance and control. He casts himself as a misunderstood statesman, speaks of religious tolerance, casts suspicion on international actors, and seeks to position the Arakan Army as the only legitimate authority in Arakan. Again, this is less about explanation than image management, a strategic performance aimed at disarming critics while reaffirming the Arakan Army's claim to power. Beneath the performance lie 4 core manoeuvres: total denial of responsibility, deflection to external conspiracies, avoidance of independent scrutiny, and a conditional vision of reconciliation. Twan Mrat Naing begins his interview with a wave of emotion. He recalls, "The sea breeze was unforgettable." It's more than a moment of nostalgia. It's a way of humanising himself, a deliberate effort to make his leadership feel personal, even poetic. And it's also calculated symbolism. He casts himself not merely as a military leader, but as a returning sovereign, evoking a mythic homecoming. In doing so, he seeks to portray the Arakan Army not as an insurgent force, but as a proto-state actor, capable of governing territory, securing communities, and restoring public order. Twan Mrat Naing emphasises acts of governance, reopening mosques, reconvening elders, regulating local affairs. These gestures suggest an aspiration for legitimate rule. The Arakan Army is being framed here as the alternative to both the military junta and the ousted National League for Democracy, an entity capable of both military victory and moral leadership. It's aimed especially at international actors, the ones wary of armed groups, but still willing to engage with local authorities who promise so-called stability. Twan Mrat Naing devotes considerable time to blaming Bangladesh's security agencies for the rise and persistence of armed Rohingya groups, like the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and the Rohingya Solidarity Organisation. He accuses Bangladeshi intelligence of having played a foundational role in creating these groups, describing them, metaphorically, as the midwife that first brought them into being, and claims they continue to be recycled to destabilise the Arakan Army political project. Whether or not these claims hold merit, their function within the interview is clear: to cast the Arakan Army as a force under siege, squeezed between a predatory junta on one side and foreign-sponsored militants on the other. This framing allows the Arakan Army to deflect blame for atrocities like the massacre of civilians at Hatan Shah Khan village, and recast regional instability as the product of foreign interference, not of its own governance. No doubt the tactic here is to preempt calls for accountability and reframe the Arakan Army not as a perpetrator, but as a victim of transnational destabilisation. Twan Mrat Naing devotes a striking amount of energy to undermining repatriation efforts. He does so not by rejecting the principle outright, but by redefining its terms. He targets Bangladesh's interim leader, Muhammad Yunus, by name, accusing him of over-promising a return before Eid next year, and dismisses such claims as political theatre. In his telling, the repatriation agenda is not a humanitarian or legal necessity, but a geopolitical ploy, one aimed at smuggling in militants, advancing diaspora agendas, and pressuring the AA through the language of responsibility to protect. He aims to delegitimize any form of return that does not proceed through Arakan Army-controlled channels. He simultaneously neutralizes international demands for rights-based repatriation by framing them as naive or co-opted. In effect, Twan Mrat Naing is saying that the Arakan Army welcomes returnees, but only on its terms, under its vetting, and stripped of any political autonomy. It's an effort to entrench its gatekeeping power over mobility, identity, and territory. His thoughts on reconciliation offer a calculated model of managed inclusion that is deeply conditional. While the Arakan Army claims credit for preventing communal violence in central Arakan, positioning itself as a neutral arbiter of public order, the terms of this inclusion remain highly restrictive. He repeatedly invokes Muslim citizens, carefully avoiding the collective political identity of Rohingya, and speaks of rights only in the same breath as responsibilities and loyalty to Myanmar and to the Arakan region. Loyalty here is not abstract. It is defined by political quiescence. Those who align with the Arakan Army authority, participate in its vision, and stay clear of diaspora networks are included. Those who dissent are branded as extremists or pawns. This tiered model of acceptance mimics the exclusionary practices of previous regimes. It offers an appearance of stability while systematically delegitimizing the Rohingya community's collective identity, historical grievances, and aspiration for non-conditional rights. True reconciliation would require the Arakan Army to move past the denial of the Rohingya identity and offer an open reckoning for its own actions. Confronted with allegations of massacres, torture, forced labour and disappearances, Twan Mrat Naing launches a counterattack. He calls them fabrications, part of a disinformation war waged by Rohingya activists, foreign media and Western governments. He fixates on details, the placement of helmets in photos, inconsistencies in casualty numbers, to cast doubt on the entire body of allegations. He points to the mechanics of international pressure, referencing the US and China, to assert that even major global powers are susceptible to the same kind of accusation campaign. This tactic serves to reframe the serious accusations as mere lawfare, suggesting that if established states like the US, China, and whoever are vulnerable to these, quote, clauses and mechanisms, unquote, the AA's plight is simply part of an unavoidable political campaign, thereby minimising the gravity of the charges. Twan Mrat Naing's most telling manoeuvre is his use of a falsified claim of diaspora interference. He brandishes an audio clip as proof that activists were offering Rohingya youth $2,000 to attack in Rakhine. This was presented as his strongest evidence that the diaspora was orchestrating militancy. In fact, I am the creator of the video containing that audio, and I can confirm that he completely distorted its meaning. The voice was that of Rohingya activist Nai San Lwin, urging refugees not to accept a $2,000 USD cash for return offer tied to a Bangladesh-Myanmar pilot repatriation scheme. My reporting in The Diplomat had exposed Bangladesh's role in pushing this offer. The junta too was keen to see it implemented. But the point was simple. Refugees were being pressured to trade away their right to their original homes. It had nothing to do with violence and nothing to do with the Arakan Army. By twisting this into proof of militant conspiracy, Twan Mrat Naing revealed the fragility of his defence and his deliberate falsification. In the end, his narrative is less a response to accountability than an attempt to outmaneuver it. Taken as a whole, Twan Mrat Naing's interview is not a roadmap to reconciliation, but a manifesto for control. He speaks the language of citizenship, rights and responsibilities, but only as a conditional bargain. Rights as rewards for loyalty, identity erased or diluted to Muslim citizens, and dissent treated as extremism. This is hard to describe as pluralism. It is a managed inclusion that mirrors the exclusionary logic of Myanmar's military and successive governments. By denying atrocities, misrepresenting evidence, and refusing independent scrutiny, the Arakan Army leader has not offered a credible response to the grave allegations before him. Furthermore, while he may indeed be factually correct that elements of the Bangladeshi security apparatus actively encourage and exploit armed Rohingya groups like the RSO to undermine the Arakan Army, his heavy focus on this external threat serves a primary political purpose: to absolve the Arakan Army of responsibility for its own recent abuses and cast his movement as a victim of transnational chaos rather than a contributor. Far from signalling a break with past persecution, this posture signals continuity. That means a future for the Rohingya defined not by justice or equality, but by conditional subordination to yet another armed authority. And yet, what his words ultimately reveal is the ideological continuity in Myanmar's genocidal mindset. Across classes, political parties, and ethnic armed groups, even among those who oppose the junta, there runs a common rejection of the Rohingya as a people, of their ethnic identity, and of their documented historical presence in Arakan as indigenous as the Kachin, Karen, Mon, Chin, Shan, and Rakhine themselves. The Rohingya do not call themselves by their religion, but by their ethnicity, just as every other group in Myanmar does. The Arakan Army refusal to acknowledge this, and its framing of repatriation as an act of Rakhine generosity, rather than a matter of justice and restitution, is not reconciliation, but erasure. It is a continuation of the very logic of persecution that the International Court of Justice has deemed serious enough to warrant emergency orders to prevent genocide.